Partitioning is one of those Linux skills that feels like it should be purely technical, but the exam treats it as a decision-making topic because the choices you make at the partition layer affect boot reliability, future growth, and how safely you can identify storage over time. A partition plan is essentially the blueprint you give the system for how a disk should be divided, and that blueprint becomes the foundation for everything above it, including file systems, mounts, and even the ability to start the operating system. New learners sometimes picture partitioning as a one-time setup step you do during installation and then never think about again. But systems evolve, disks get replaced, and storage layouts change, so the plan needs to be resilient. The purpose of this lesson is to help you reason about those decisions in a structured way. Choosing between partition table styles, planning for growth, choosing stable identifiers, and verifying that your plan matches reality. If you can hold these ideas together, partitioning questions stop sounding like trivia and start sounding like common sense engineering. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyber.author.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A partition table is the metadata that describes how a disk is divided into usable regions, and the two major styles you will see in Linux Plus questions are master boot record, MBR, and GUID partition table, GPT. The exam is not asking you to worship one of them. It is asking you to understand what each one implies, what limitations exist, and why a modern system might choose one over the other. MBR is older and widely compatible, but it carries historical constraints that show up in practical decisions, especially around how many partitions you can have and how large the disk can be while still being represented cleanly. GPT is the newer standard that was designed to address those limitations, and it is commonly paired with modern firmware approaches. The most important beginner takeaway is that MBR and GPT are not file systems, and they are not partitions. They are the index cards that describe where partitions begin and end. If that index is wrong, everything above it becomes hard to interpret, which is why the exam wants you to respect this layer. When you compare MBR and GPT, you can think of MBR as a simpler, older map format that still works in many situations, while GPT is a newer map format built to scale and to be more robust. MBR traditionally supports a limited number of primary partitions, and it relies on a workaround called an extended partition to create additional logical partitions, which adds complexity and can be a point of confusion. GPT, by contrast, is designed to support many partitions without relying on that same layered workaround, and it generally handles large disks more gracefully. Another important difference is resilience. GPT stores partition information in ways that make recovery more feasible if part of the metadata is damaged, while MBR is more fragile in that sense because so much depends on a small critical area. The exam often frames this as a reliability and maintainability decision rather than as a purely historical fact. If a scenario mentions modern systems, large disks, or a desire for clearer structure, GPT tends to align with that intent, while MBR might appear in compatibility-focused contexts. Boot compatibility is tied closely to partition table decisions, and this is where firmware style enters the conversation in a practical way. Older systems often booted with Basic Input-Output System, BIOS, while many modern systems use Unified Extensible Firmware Interface, UEFI, and the exam expects you to understand that the firmware and the partitioning scheme are part of the same boot story. BIOS environments historically aligned well with MBR-style boot patterns, while UEFI environments commonly use GPT as the expected modern approach. That does not mean there is no flexibility, but it does mean the safest default in many modern contexts is to pair UEFI with GPT, because that pairing matches the design assumptions of contemporary platforms. When a question hints at UEFI booting, it is often also hinting at a particular way of organizing boot-related partitions and ensuring the system can find what it needs early. The key beginner mindset is that boot is a chain of handoffs, and partitioning is one of the earliest assumptions in that chain. If you choose a scheme that conflicts with the environment's expectations, the failure can occur long before any user login or service starts. Even when you are not thinking about boot, partitioning decisions are really growth decisions because you are choosing how easily the storage layout can adapt when requirements change. Growth can mean the disk gets larger, the workload expands, or a new application needs space in a specific place, and a good partition plan avoids painting you into a corner. The exam often tests growth thinking by describing a system that started small and then needed expansion, and it asks you to recognize what choices would have made that easier. Planning for growth does not require predicting the future perfectly. It requires separating areas that grow unpredictably from areas that should stay stable. For example, variable data tends to grow in bursts and may need room to expand, while certain system areas can remain relatively steady. A plan that allocates everything tightly can work on day one and then fail suddenly when logs, updates, or application data fill the available space. The practical lesson is that partitioning is risk management at the storage level, and the exam rewards decisions that leave breathing room and reduce the chance of emergency changes later. One of the most exam-relevant growth ideas is that expanding storage is easier when you design with clear boundaries and stable identification, because changes often involve adding a new disk, replacing a disk, or extending available capacity. If your partition plan is complicated and tightly coupled to a particular disk order, even a simple hardware change can cause confusion. If your plan relies on fragile device naming, the system might point at the wrong place after a change, which looks like missing data even when the data is intact. The exam likes to describe those moments as surprises, such as a system that boots to the wrong environment or cannot find expected mounts after hardware replacement. Your job is to recognize that a good plan anticipates replacement and expansion by using stable identifiers and by verifying that the system will still know which storage is which. Growth planning also includes thinking about what happens when you need more partitions, which is where the practical limitations of MBR can matter, because certain expansions become awkward if you are already at the limits. The deeper point is that growth is not only about capacity. It is about keeping the system's storage identity consistent as the environment evolves. Identifiers are the glue that connects partitioning to mounting, and Linux Plus questions often pivot on the difference between unstable names and stable identities. A beginner might see a device path and assume it is a permanent label, but many device names depend on detection order, and that order can change after reboot, hardware changes, or timing differences. That means a reference that looks correct today might refer to a different device tomorrow, especially in systems with multiple disks. A more stable approach is to use identifiers that are intended to remain consistent, such as file system labels or a universally unique value associated with a file system. On the first mention only, that common identifier is universally unique identifier, UUID, and the important point is that UUID values are designed to be unique and stable for identification purposes. If you use UUID-based identification in your mental model, you stop thinking in terms of whatever disk happened to appear first and start thinking in terms of the specific storage object you meant to reference. The exam rewards this because it aligns with reliability and reduces the chance of boot and mount surprises. It is also important to distinguish between identifying a partition and identifying a file system, because beginners often assume the identifier is attached to the disk region itself in the same way in all cases. A partition is a region defined by boundaries in the partition table, while a file system is the structure placed inside that region, and the identifier used for mounting is often tied to the file system rather than to the partition boundary metadata. That difference matters because you might change the file system without changing the partition boundaries, or you might recreate a file system and accidentally change its identity even though the partition layout appears unchanged. In practical terms, if a scenario describes that a system suddenly cannot find a file system after formatting or rebuilding, it can be a clue that the identifier changed and the system is still looking for the old one. This is not a command problem. It is a concept problem. The system is following an identity reference that no longer matches what exists. The exam likes these scenarios because they test whether you can reason about identity as a contract between configuration and storage. If the contract changes, the system's behavior changes, and your job is to spot that mismatch. Verification is the step that turns a partition plan from a hopeful design into a reliable reality, and the exam frequently tests verification mindset even when it does not use that word. Verification means checking that the partition table is what you intended, that the partitions you expect actually exist, and that the identifiers you plan to rely on are stable and correctly referenced by the system. It also means verifying that the system can still boot and mount correctly after the layout is in place, because a layout that looks correct on paper can still fail if a critical early assumption is wrong. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking verification is only something you do when something breaks. But in storage work, verification is part of doing it safely. The exam often frames this as choosing the safest next step after a change. And the safest step is often to confirm the system's view of storage matches your mental model before you proceed to higher-level changes. Verification also includes sanity checks about what should happen on reboot, because the reboot is when device ordering and timing differences reveal whether your identifiers and assumptions are truly stable. If you approach partitioning as a loop of design and verification, you are thinking the way the exam expects. A good verification mindset also involves checking for the kinds of mistakes that are common when partitioning, because the exam often includes distractor answers that reflect those mistakes. One common mistake is confusing the raw disk with a partition, leading to actions that target the wrong layer and therefore do not fix the problem described. Another is creating partitions correctly, but forgetting that a file system is required before the storage can be used as files and directories, which shows up as a region that exists but cannot be mounted meaningfully. A third is mounting something in a way that hides existing content, causing a user to think files vanished when they are simply behind a mount. A fourth is relying on an unstable identifier, which causes intermittent or post-reboot failures that feel random until you remember how device naming works. The exam will often describe the symptom and then offer choices that correspond to these mistakes, and your job is to choose the option that reflects correct layer thinking. Verification is how you protect yourself from these mistakes in real life, and layer thinking is how you protect yourself from them on the exam. Another part of verification that the exam cares about is evidence-driven reasoning, meaning you decide based on what the system is actually doing, not based on what you assume it should be doing. In partitioning scenarios, evidence might be that the system sees a disk but not the expected partitions, or that it sees partitions but not a file system, or that it can mount a file system but not at the intended location after reboot. Each of those observations points to a different layer and therefore a different kind of corrective action. The exam often gives you just enough detail to make that distinction if you are trained to listen for it, and a strong student can use that detail to eliminate half the answer options quickly. Evidence-driven reasoning also means you resist the urge to make sweeping changes, like reinstalling or rebuilding everything, when the evidence suggests the problem is a simple mismatch of identifiers or a partition table choice. That restraint is part of what makes a decision defensible, because the least risky change that restores alignment is usually the best. When you think this way, verification is not a separate activity. It is the way you decide what to do next. Planning for growth also includes planning for change management, which is a fancy way of saying you should know what happens if you later decide to adjust sizes or add space. Even without talking about specific tools, you can understand that resizing partitions and file systems carries risk, and that risk is reduced when the layout was designed with future change in mind. A layout that leaves no free space on a disk makes later changes more complex, because you may need to move boundaries rather than simply adding new space. A layout that uses clear separation of concerns can make changes safer, because you can expand the area that needs growth without disturbing unrelated areas. The exam may phrase this as choosing a partitioning approach that supports future expansion, and the correct reasoning often favors designs that avoid hitting hard limits and that keep identification stable. This is also where GPT can appear as the better long-term foundation, because it avoids certain structural constraints that can complicate later changes. The deeper lesson is that partitioning is a forward-looking decision, and the exam is testing whether you can think beyond the immediate installation moment. It is also worth connecting partitioning decisions to troubleshooting stories you might see, because partitioning issues rarely announce themselves as partitioning issues. They show up as boot failures, missing mounts, wrong mounts, or disk space problems that surprise people because the total disk size looks large. The mental model that prevents confusion is to remember that the partition map determines what portions of the disk are available for which purposes, And a large disk with a small root partition can still run out of space quickly in that root region even if other regions are empty. This is a classic exam trick, not in the sense of unfairness, but in the sense that it tests whether you understand that free space is not universal across partitions. Your growth decisions determine where free space exists, and your mount decisions determine what parts of the system use which space. If a scenario mentions that one file system is full while the disk is not, you should immediately suspect partitioning and allocation decisions rather than a mysterious leak. When you can map the symptom back to the partition plan, you can choose answers that reflect structural thinking rather than surface-level guessing. Another subtle but important idea is that partitions are not the only way to organize storage, which is why the exam later spends time on logical volume concepts. But the partition layer remains foundational because it is often the first carving of a disk into usable pieces. Even when higher-level storage abstraction exists, there is usually a point where raw block devices are allocated into something that can be managed and identified. That means good habits at the partition layer, like using stable identifiers and verifying after changes, remain valuable even as storage becomes more flexible. This also reinforces why MBR versus GPT matters beyond history. The partition table style you choose affects how cleanly your system can represent and manage the disk in the first place. If you treat partitions as the base contract for how a disk is organized, you will see why choosing a scalable contract, planning for growth, and verifying that the contract is correctly applied is worth the attention. The exam is essentially testing whether you understand that storage management is a chain of contracts, and partitioning is one of the earliest and most influential contracts. When you respect that, later topics become easier to reason about because you are not building on shaky assumptions. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain partitioning decisions as a set of linked choices that affect boot compatibility, future growth, reliable identification, and confidence through verification. You should understand MBR and GPT as different partition table styles with different scalability and robustness implications, and you should be able to connect those implications to modern firmware expectations like UEFI and legacy patterns like BIOS without treating it as mere trivia. You should also be able to describe why growth planning is really about avoiding tight layouts and hard limits, and why stable identifiers like UUID values reduce the chance of post-change surprises. Finally, you should have a verification mindset that treats evidence as the guide, checks layer by layer, and prefers the smallest safe change that restores alignment when something is off. If you carry this approach forward, you will be well prepared for the upcoming file system and mounting topics, because you will already be thinking in a disciplined way about layers, identity, and the difference between what you intended and what the system can actually see.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.